The Beatles stopped the show. When saw this, what he did next made 15,000 fans stand up. The air inside Shea Stadium was thick with anticipation and summer heat. August 15th, 1965. New York City. The Beatles were about to perform for 55,600 screaming fans, the largest concert audience in history. But nobody knew that in less than 20 minutes, four men from Liverpool would stop their entire show for a 5-year-old girl holding a handmade poster. John Lennon stood backstage, smoking a cigarette, trying to hear himself think over the roar of the crowd. The screaming had already started, and they hadn't even walked on stage yet. "This is madness," George Harrison said, shaking his head. "Complete bloody madness." Paul McCartney was pacing, nervous energy radiating from every movement. 55,000 people, lads. 55,000. Ringo just sat on a folding chair, drumsticks in hand, looking remarkably calm for someone about to play the biggest concert of their lives. "It's just another show," Ringo said with a shrug. John laughed bitterly. "Just another show where nobody can hear us play because they're too busy screaming." The truth was, the Beatles were exhausted. Exhausted from touring. Exhausted from the constant screaming. Exhausted from being treated like products instead of musicians. They'd been on the road for years, playing venues that got bigger and bigger while the connection with their audience got smaller and smaller. Tonight was supposed to be their triumph. The biggest concert ever. Proof that the Beatles were the biggest band in the world. Instead, it felt like a prison sentence. 5 minutes, boys," Brian Epstein called from the doorway. His face was tight with stress. Everything had to be perfect tonight. The whole world was watching. As they walked through the concrete corridors toward the stage, the roar of the crowd grew louder. Deafening. Overwhelming. Inhuman. They emerged onto the tiny stage set up near second base, and the sound hit them like a physical force. 55,600 people screaming at once. Not singing. Not cheering. Just screaming. A wall of noise so loud that John couldn't hear his own guitar when he strummed it. They launched into Twist and Shout, and immediately, everything was wrong. The amplifiers were pathetically inadequate for a venue this size. The vocals were completely lost. The guitars sounded like toys. This wasn't a concert. This was chaos. But they kept playing because that's what you do. You keep going even when everything is falling apart. 3 songs in, during She's a Woman, something caught Paul's attention. In the front section, right near the stage, a small child was standing on her seat. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Dark curly hair, wearing a yellow dress, and she was holding up a poster. Not screaming like everyone around her, just holding up this poster with both hands, tears streaming down her face. Paul squinted, trying to read what it said. But the lights were too bright, and he was too far away. He nudged John and pointed. John looked, and his expression changed. Something about this little girl, so small, so quiet in the midst of all this chaos, demanded attention. When She's a Woman ended, Paul did something unprecedented. Instead of launching into the next song, he walked to the edge of the stage and pointed at the little girl. The crowd, sensing something unusual was happening, started to quiet down. Just slightly. Just enough. "Hold on a second, folks," Paul said into his microphone. "There's a little girl down here with a sign, and I can't quite read it." Security guards were already moving toward the child, thinking she might be in danger. But Paul held up his hand. "Can someone help her up here? I want to see what her sign says." The request was so unexpected that it took a moment for anyone to react. Then a security guard gently lifted the little girl, poster and all, and carried her toward the stage. As she got closer, Paul could finally read what was written on her homemade poster. And what he read made him stop breathing. The poster was made from cardboard, decorated with crayons and glitter. A child's artwork. Simple, honest, beautiful. And written in large, careful letters were 5 words. My brother can't hear you. Paul felt his throat tighten. John had walked over now, and George, and even Ringo had left his drums to see what was happening. The security guard lifted the little girl onto the stage, and she stood there, tiny and trembling, still holding her poster. What's your name, sweetheart? Paul asked, kneeling down to her level. Sophie, the little girl said, her voice barely audible, even with the microphone nearby. Sophie, that's a beautiful name. Can you tell me about your brother? Sophie looked out at the massive crowd, overwhelmed, then back at Paul. His name is Danny. He's 7. He can't hear anything because he was born deaf. The stadium, which had been gradually quieting, went completely silent. 55,600 people holding their breath. He's deaf? Paul repeated gently. Sophie nodded, tears flowing freely now. He loves the Beatles so much. He puts his hands on the radio speakers to feel the vibrations. That's how he listens to your music, through his hands. John felt something break open inside his chest. All this time, they'd been complaining about the screaming, about not being able to hear themselves play. And here was a 7-year-old boy who would give anything just to hear them at all. Where is Danny now? George asked, his voice soft. He's at home, Sophie said. Mama couldn't afford tickets for all of us, so she brought me, and I promised Danny I would hold up this sign so you would know about him. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. Paul looked at John, and John looked back. And in that moment, an entire conversation happened without words. This is why we make music. Not for the screaming. Not for the fame. For kids like Danny who experience it in ways we never imagined. Paul stood up and addressed the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sophie. She came here tonight to tell us about her brother Danny, who is 7 years old and deaf. Danny loves the Beatles, but he experiences our music through vibrations instead of sound. The crowd was absolutely silent now. Listening. Really listening. For the first time all night. Sophie, John said, stepping forward. Would you like to stay up here with us for the rest of the show? Sophie's eyes went wide. Really? Really, John said, smiling genuinely for the first time all night. And we're going to do something special. Something for Danny. What happened next would become one of the most legendary moments in Beatles history. John turned to the band and the sound crew. I need you to turn up the bass as loud as it will go. I want every person in this stadium to feel the music, not just hear it. The sound engineers looked confused. Sir, if we turn the bass up that high, I don't care what it'll do, John interrupted. There's a 7-year-old boy at home who experiences music through vibrations. I want to play this next song so loud that he can feel it from here. Paul understood immediately what John was doing. We're going to play I Feel Fine, Paul announced to the crowd. And we're going to play it louder than we've ever played anything before, because there's a boy named Danny who needs to feel this music. The crowd erupted not with screaming, but with understanding applause. Sophie stood on the stage, still holding her poster, tears streaming down her face. The Beatles launched into I Feel Fine, and the bass was so loud that the entire stadium vibrated. People could feel it in their chests, in their bones, in their souls. This wasn't just music anymore. This was a physical experience. And somewhere in Queens, In a small apartment, a 7-year-old deaf boy named Danny was sitting with his hands pressed against the family's radio speaker. His mother, Mary Chen, had the radio turned to the station broadcasting the concert live. She'd told Danny that Sophie was at the concert, that she was holding up the sign they'd made together. Danny couldn't hear the music. But suddenly, he could feel something. A vibration, stronger than anything he'd ever felt before. The entire apartment seemed to be shaking with the bass from Shea Stadium. Danny's face lit up with pure joy. He started moving to the rhythm he could feel, dancing in a way his mother had never seen before. "Mama!" he signed frantically. "I can feel them. I can feel the Beatles." Back at Shea Stadium, something magical was happening. The crowd had stopped screaming. They were swaying, moving, feeling the music instead of just hearing it. Sophie was dancing on stage with the Beatles, and John had tears streaming down his face as he sang. When the song ended, the applause was different, deeper, more meaningful. Paul knelt down beside Sophie again. "Sophie, I want you to take a message to Danny for us. Can you do that?" Sophie nodded eagerly. "Tell him that tonight, he taught the Beatles something important. He taught us that music isn't just about sound. It's about feeling. It's about connection. And he experiences our music in a way that's just as beautiful as anyone else, maybe even more beautiful." George stepped forward. "And tell Danny that from now on, when we make records, we're going to think about him. We're going to make sure the bass is strong enough that people can feel it, not just hear it." Ringo, usually the quiet one, added his voice. "Tell Danny he's our inspiration. He reminds us why we make music in the first place." What the Beatles didn't know was that their decision to stop the show for Sophie and Danny was being broadcast live on radio across the country. Millions of people heard Paul's words about Danny, heard John's decision to turn up the bass so a deaf child could feel the music, heard the moment when the Beatles transformed from entertainers into something more. Healers, teachers, human beings who cared. Within hours, the phone lines at radio stations across America were jammed with calls. Parents of deaf children calling to say thank you. Music teachers calling to talk about the importance of making music accessible to everyone. Musicians calling to say they'd been inspired to think differently about their craft. The story made the front page of the New York Times the next morning. Beatles stop concert for deaf boy's sister. But it wasn't just a news story. It was a movement. Schools for the deaf began incorporating Beatles music into their programs, using the vibrations to help children connect with rhythm and melody. Concert venues started thinking about accessibility for people with hearing impairments. And the Beatles themselves were transformed. After that night at Shea Stadium, they approached their music differently. They started paying more attention to the bass lines, to the physical feeling of the music. Albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver featured some of the most innovative bass work in rock history. Paul McCartney's bass playing became legendary not just for its technical skill, but for its feeling. "I think about Danny every time I play," Paul said in an interview years later. "I think about making sure the music has enough body, enough presence, that someone could feel it, even if they couldn't hear it." 3 days after the Shea Stadium concert, the Beatles did something unprecedented. They went to Queens to visit Danny Chen. No press, no photographers, just 4 musicians visiting a 7-year-old boy who had reminded them why music mattered. Mary Chen answered the door to find John, Paul, George, and Ringo standing on her doorstep, looking nervous. "Mrs. Chen," Paul said, "we're here to meet Danny." Mary was speechless. She'd heard about what happened at the concert. Sophie had told her everything, but she never imagined the Beatles would actually come to their home. Danny was in the living room, sitting on the floor with his hands on the radio speaker, trying to feel the vibrations of whatever music was playing. When he looked up and saw the Beatles walking into his living room, his face transformed. Pure joy. Pure wonder. Pure love. John knelt down beside Danny and began signing. The Beatles had spent the past 3 days learning basic sign language. Hello, Danny. We're the Beatles. Your sister told us about you. Danny's eyes filled with tears. Nobody outside his family had ever bothered to learn sign language to talk to him. And here were the Beatles, the biggest band in the world, signing to him in his own language. Thank you for teaching us about music, Paul signed. You showed us that it's not just about sound, it's about feeling. George had brought his guitar. Danny, we want to play something for you. Not for you to hear, for you to feel. They set up in the Chen family's small living room, and they played I Feel Fine Again. But this time, they had Danny put his hands on Paul's bass guitar, on George's acoustic, on Ringo's drum, on John's amplifier. Danny experienced the Beatles' music the way he'd always dreamed of, not through his ears, but through his entire body. He danced. He laughed. He cried. And the Beatles played for him like they were playing for 55,000 people. Because in that moment, Danny was their entire audience. And he was the most important audience they'd ever had. When they finished, Danny signed something to his mother. Mary translated, her voice shaking with emotion. He says, "This is the best day of my whole life. The Beatles came to my house and played music just for me." John wiped his eyes. Tell him it's one of the best days of our lives, too. The story of Sophie's poster and Danny's experience with music spread far beyond that one concert. It changed how people thought about accessibility in music. It changed how the Beatles approached their craft. And it changed countless lives. Within a year, major concert venues across America had installed special sections with enhanced bass speakers for audience members with hearing impairments. Music therapy programs for deaf children exploded in popularity. And the Beatles became advocates for accessibility in the arts. They donated money to schools for the deaf. They insisted that their concerts include accommodations for people with disabilities. They used their platform to remind the world that music belongs to everyone, regardless of how they experience it. Danny Chen grew up to become a music therapist, working specifically with deaf children. The Beatles showed me that my deafness wasn't a limitation, Danny said in interviews. It was just a different way of experiencing something beautiful. Sophie became a sign language interpreter and an advocate for deaf rights. That night at Shea Stadium taught me that sometimes the smallest voice, or in my case, the quietest poster, can change everything, Sophie reflected. The poster itself, the handmade cardboard sign that said, "My brother can't hear you," was donated to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It hangs there today, a reminder that music is about more than sound. It's about connection, about feeling, about reaching across any barrier to touch someone's soul. The Beatles played hundreds more concerts after that night at Shea Stadium. They made more albums. They changed music history. But when people asked them about their most meaningful performance, they often came back to that moment. The moment when they stopped everything for a 5-year-old girl with a homemade poster. "We were so caught up in the machinery of being the Beatles," John Lennon said in one of his final interviews. The screaming, the chaos, the feeling that nobody was really listening to our music. And then Sophie showed us that someone was listening, or rather, feeling, in a way we'd never imagined. Paul McCartney was more direct. Danny Chen saved the Beatles that night. We were ready to quit touring because we felt disconnected from our audience. But Danny reminded us that our music mattered in ways we couldn't even comprehend. George Harrison, always the spiritual one, saw deeper meaning. That night taught me that art isn't about the artist. It's about the connection between the art and the person experiencing it. Danny experienced our music more purely than anyone in that stadium because he had to feel it with his whole being. Ringo Starr simply said, "Best show we ever played." Not because of the size of the crowd, because of one little boy who taught us what music really is. The story of the Beatles, Sophie, and Danny became a parable in the music industry. It's taught in music schools as an example of accessibility and inclusion. It's cited by disability rights advocates as a moment when mainstream culture recognized that different abilities don't mean lesser experiences. And it's remembered by Beatles fans as the moment when four young men from Liverpool remembered their humanity. Today, there's a music therapy center in Queens named after Danny Chen. The Beatles funded its construction in 1967, and it still serves deaf and hard-of-hearing children. Every year, on August 15th, the anniversary of that Shea Stadium concert, they hold a special event where musicians play for deaf children, emphasizing the physical, vibrational experience of music. Sophie and Danny both attend every year. Now in their 60s, they still tell the story of the night the Beatles stopped their biggest concert for a little girl with a poster. People always ask me what it was like to be on stage with the Beatles, Sophie says. But the truth is, the most amazing part wasn't being on stage. It was watching four of the most famous people in the world choose compassion over spectacle, choose connection over performance, choose my brother over their show. Danny, through his interpreter, adds, "The Beatles gave me more than music that night. They gave me dignity. They showed the world that my way of experiencing music was just as valid as anyone else's. That changed my life." The poster that started it all, that simple cardboard sign with 5 words written in crayon, represents something profound. It represents the power of speaking up, even when your voice is small. It represents the importance of accessibility and inclusion. It represents the truth that art belongs to everyone, regardless of how they experience it. But most importantly, it represents a moment when 4 young musicians remembered why they fell in love with music in the first place. Not for the fame, not for the screaming crowds, not for the records and the accolades, but for the connection, for the ability to touch someone's heart, for the chance to make someone feel less alone. The Beatles stopped their show that night at Shea Stadium. They stopped the biggest concert in history for a 5-year-old girl and a 7-year-old boy who couldn't hear. And in doing so, they reminded everyone watching that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop. Stop the noise. Stop the chaos. Stop the performance. And pay attention to the one person who needs you to see them. That's not just good showmanship. That's humanity. That's love. That's what music is really about. If this incredible story of compassion and accessibility moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of inclusion and seeing people for who they are. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone stopped everything to help another person? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the moments that reveal the heart behind the music.